This is just Trump operating from a position of complete ignorance, not understanding anything about the situation. He's just running his mouth, probably because he's had it filled with cable news nonsense. And yeah, it's unfortunately typical for him. Zelensky, I mean, he said the other day that Zelensky hadn't actually even read the peace plan, which is, I mean, again, astonishingly stupid thing to say. Of course, Zelensky has read it. He just doesn't agree with it.
Jimmy Rushton, a Kyiv-based journalist and foreign policy security expert, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report again.
Thanks for having me.
We'll have to start off with these comments from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He's officially said that land concessions are off the table and that compromises with the US have also not been made. So here's what he said. He said, "Do we envision conceding territories? We have no legal right to do so under the Ukrainian law, our constitution and international law, and we don't have any moral right either. Russia is insisting that we give up territories, but we don't want to cede anything. We are fighting for that, as you well know. There are difficult problems concerning the territories, and so far there has been no compromise." So what's your response to that, Jimmy?
To be honest, this has been the consistent Ukrainian position since the start of full-scale invasion, that they're not going to give up territories, and especially they're not going to give up territories which Russia has not conquered, that has not occupied. Not least because these territories in Donetsk Oblast, which is specifically what we're talking about here, are very well defended. They're the so-called fortress belt of cities, Slavansk, Kramatorsk, and others that Russia has been trying to take since way back in 2014. They haven't succeeded. And these territories are vital to the defense of other parts of Ukraine. So if Ukraine gives up these territories, especially without any form of security guarantee, which is not on the offering, seemingly, it will just invite Russia to have another go when they've rearmed, reconstituted their forces, regrouped. So yeah, for Ukraine, it's a non-starter, really.
So President Zelenskyy, he also requested that any US security guarantee, as you mentioned, Jimmy, be agreed upon with Ukraine, that it should be voted into law by US Congress. So he said that this won't be another Budapest memorandum, empty promises, but legally binding if approved. Now, just for our audience to understand what he means by that, in 1984, an agreement was made in which Ukraine gave up third largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees from major powers. So Ukraine, Russia, the US, and the UK signed off on this. And so the argument is that they haven't upheld that signed agreement. So Zelensky saying that any security guarantees that the United States agree on with Ukraine, it should be voted on in US Congress so that there's kind of more security surrounding it. So do you think that Trump will say yes to that?
To be honest, I think it's putting the cart a little bit before the horse, because what would these security guarantees actually look like in practice? A security guarantee is only of any value if the other side believes that that security guarantee would be upheld, and that it would be upheld using military force. So is this potential security guarantee, does it envision having US troops in Ukraine? Does it envision having European troops in Ukraine? Because Russia has obviously said no to both of those. So yeah, I do think if potentially if there was a security guarantee agreed, then it would need to go through Congress. I mean, treaties go through Congress anyway. That's just part of the US Constitution. That being said, I think if Trump has never let US or international law bother him, he's not supposed to be able to set tariffs on countries for the purposes of manipulating economic activity. That is not a power that is supposed to be granted to him, but he does it anyway. So I think the problem with Trump is, even if it was, even if it went into US law through Congress, he could just ignore it anyway. Yeah, unfortunately.
Trump, he told reporters on Monday, then this is a quote that's kind of been making the rounds. He said, Russia, I guess, would rather have the whole country when you think about it. But Russia is, I believe, fine with it, referring to the US plan. But I'm not sure Zelensky is fine with it. His people love it, but he hasn't read it. So if this is the truth and it's involving the US plan involves Russia getting Donbas, then of course Putin is happy, given that he doesn't even occupy all of the territory, and he'd obviously rather some territory than none at all, so that he can easily invade again in years to come when he rearms, as you said, Jimmy.
Yeah, I mean, everything about that statement is wrong. Obviously, the Ukrainian people aren't fine with it. They don't love it. It's just complete nonsense. Russia actually probably wouldn't be fine with it either because I think, as we discussed before, they've put four of these regions of eastern Ukraine into the Russian constitution as being Russian oblasts. So Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk. We're talking about the regions in the Donbas, which is Luhansk and Donetsk. But that doesn't address the point that you would then have these two other oblasts, which are in the Russian constitution as being Russian. You'd have two regional capitals, Kherson and Zaporizhia, which would be obviously under Ukrainian control, and Russia is not going to be happy with that. I don't think anyone actually believes that. But again, this is just Trump operating from a position of complete ignorance, not understanding anything about the situation. He's just running his mouth, probably because he's had it filled with cable news nonsense. And yeah, it's unfortunately typical for him. Zelensky, I mean, he said the other day that Zelensky hadn't actually even read the peace plan, which is, I mean, again, astonishingly stupid thing to say. Of course, Zelensky has read it. He just doesn't agree with it.
Donald Trump Jr. said that there is a chance that his father could walk away from the negotiating table. And we can tell by Donald Trump's remarks, the ones that you just mentioned, that he is growing frustrated. So, Jimmy, is there a way for the next steps to go as if the US backs away from negotiating tactics, they still provide Ukraine with its intelligence as much as they can, and then they still sell weapons to the EU or NATO, but the EU also steps up with military aid, weapons and funding, especially with these frozen Russian assets, as we'll get into later down the track, while the US takes a back seat. So is that kind of a way that you see it going forward in a way that could work for Ukraine, where they get the US intelligence, they get weapons funded by NATO and the EU, but the United States, Donald Trump, step away from any sort of diplomatic negotiations?
I mean, that's probably an ideal solution for the Ukrainians at this point. The Americans aren't honest, impartial negotiators. They clearly, at this point, and I'm talking about the part of the administration at least, because that there are differing views in the administration. There are different factions that want different things. You have the more traditional Republicans like Rubio, and then you have the kind of JD Vance style culture warriors that want to suck up to Russia and that think that they're a great defender of Western civilization or something like that. So it's very confused, but what you can see is Russia is America is trying to pressure Ukraine to give up territory to Russia. They seem to have dollar signs in their eyes when they're talking about these frozen funds. They think that they can profit from the reconstruction of Ukraine, which is kind of obscene. And yeah, I think if the Americans could walk away, could recuse themselves from the negotiations and provide intelligence support and still sell weapons to NATO. And again, obviously the Americans make a lot of money when they sell weapons to NATO that are provided to Ukraine. I don't think Trump would want to cancel that, because that would be they'd be American jobs. He's essentially turning down a profit from American arms industries. But yeah, if Europe could continue buying those, and then Europe again needs to set up stand up support for Ukraine on a far larger scale, and we need to do something about these assets held in Belgium, because this is a fundamentally serious moment for European security, and quite frankly, one of the things that I do have a little bit of sympathy with the Americans with is when they talk about Europe not taking it seriously enough. I agree with that. Europe hasn't taken it seriously enough. This is the future of our continent, and we need to act like it, to be honest.
So President Zelensky, he said that he's short of around 600 million pounds to buy US weapons, even as several European countries have in the last few weeks committed more millions to help Ukraine. But the Times is reporting that this deal to secure this $100 billion pounds worth of frozen Russian assets currently held in Belgium could be secured within the next few weeks. So Jimmy, just to emphasize on your point before, how important is it that EU leaders push Belgium to stop worrying about how Russia will react, how Russia could respond for paying for their own war, and give these 100 billion pounds worth of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine?
It's very important that this happens. It will enable this war to be financed through Russian funds. It will mean that European taxpayers don't have to spend as much. And fundamentally, I understand to some degree the Belgian concerns, but I also think a lot of those concerns are not genuine. I don't believe there is ever going to be a case that Russia would be able to mount a successful court action against Belgium or any other nation in Europe, for that matter. I mean, just look at what's happened over the last 3 years, for example, and this is one example. There were hundreds of airplanes that were chartered, at least that were run by Russian airlines, and they were mainly leased out of countries in Ireland. And when the full-scale invasion kicked off and when sanctions were placed on Russia, Russia just stole them. They stole billions of dollars worth of airplanes. So, I mean, it's not just, legal accountability would go one way. There'd be multiple claims that you could make against Russia for their malfeasance and their aggression against Ukraine and other European countries, because obviously we've had all these acts of sabotage across Europe. We've had Russian GRU agents burning down Polish warehouses. We've had munitions plants in Eastern Europe being blown up by Russian agents, and this is all relatively well documented and well proven. So, that's assuming that you could even have some form of kind of legal redress for any of this. The reality is, Russia is never going to be able to sue anyone in Western courts ever. We're not going to be able to sue anyone in Russian courts. So these Irish leasing companies are never going to get their planes back, and they're never going to be compensated for it. But it's I think we need to just take a step back and look at the feasibility of some of these excuses and the kind of the practicality of some of these scare stories and these kind of worst case scenarios that are coming out of countries like Belgium, because I don't think they're realistic in my view.
When you see Zelensky say that he's short of 600 million pounds to buy US weapons, what kind of equipment and machinery is the Ukrainian army in desperate need of when you're speaking to militants? Either it's coming from the US stockpile or it's coming from EU and NATO allies.
Okay, so the number one item that the Ukrainians want from the Americans is air defense equipment. So the Americans are the only people that make the Patriot interceptors. And they are the most effective weapons against ballistic missiles, particularly. There's a couple of other systems that can theoretically deal with ballistic missiles, but they don't work that well, if I'm honest. Other than that, material like S-16 components and support, 155mm howitzers and shells, various electronic warfare systems, anti-drone equipment. There's a lot that the Ukrainians would want from the Americans, and there's a lot that they want to buy from the Americans. But that being said, European defense concerns, they make some excellent equipment, and to be honest with you, if you could solve the problem of these kind of specific capabilities that Ukraine can't buy from Europe, they could be a lot more self-sufficient in a European context by buying stuff from Europe funded by frozen Russian assets.
Say these frozen Russian assets are confiscated and unfrozen, given to Ukraine the next few weeks. How far can 100 billion pounds get Ukraine? Obviously, not all of it will go towards weaponry. There was always discussions whether this money should be used for rebuilding Ukraine once the war is over, but it's become quite clear that without the help of US negotiating a proper end to this war, without it not ruining the sovereignty of Ukraine, providing money to Ukraine to win this war on their own terms is the next best option. So how far does that money stretch?
It very much depends what you're buying with it. If you're spending it in Ukraine to manufacture Ukrainian weapons, it goes a lot further. But again, there are some capabilities that that Ukrainians can't build themselves. They're very good at building drones. They're very good at building, some lighter armored vehicles. But other stuff they can't build, or they can't build fast enough. You're right in regards to the conversation about these funds should be used for reconstruction. Well, you got to win the war first. So to be honest, again, cart coming before the horse when you're talking about using these funds for reconstruction, because if Ukraine doesn't win the war, there's going to be nothing to reconstruct. It's just going to be Russia, right? So they need to be spent. They need to be spent on armaments. They need to be spent on just other things. Like, there's been a big problem in Ukraine of poor quality training, and I've written quite a bit about this. And there needs to be investment in creating high quality training centers, especially in the west of Ukraine, where they're further away from Russian missile strikes. And there also needs to be, I think, investment in a significant amount of counter drone capability. This is also something that the West could benefit from and help Ukraine. I mean, the last couple of weeks, we had multiple cases of drone incursions. We had that case in Ireland where some drones flew into the path of Zelensky's jet as it was landing just off Dublin. Then a couple of days later, we had a case off the coast of France where some drones were flying over the home base of the French nuclear submarine fleet, and French police actually shot at these drones and downed a couple of electronic warfare. But this is a problem that Ukraine has kind of got a handle on, really. They've started producing these interceptor drones, these interceptor FPVs, which take down these Shahid drones, which Russia launches in the hundreds every night. And these interceptor drones are $2,300 each, so they're very, very cheap in military terms. And they absolutely answer the question that Europe is struggling to find the answer for, which is how can we defend ourselves against these drones? How can we protect airports against drone incursions? How can we protect sensitive sites like power stations and military bases from these incursions? And if we started collaborating with Ukraine and maybe bringing production of these interceptor drones back to the UK or other European countries, we can produce them en masse. We can get knowledge from the Ukrainians, and we can kind of, kill two birds with one stone, or two birds with one drone, if you excuse the pun.
I think that the UK army, the British Army, has actually been looking at using the blueprint of Ukraine's drone system and the fact that they were able to work under such little resources and such a time crunch. But Jimmy, I want to read out a few stats of recent polling when it comes to how Americans are reacting to helping Ukraine. Now, there's been a stark shift in the last year with how Americans feel about Ukraine. It was obviously a big topic at the 2024 election with this America First agenda versus helping out countries in need. So a new Reagan National Defense Survey has shown that 64% of Americans now favor the US sending lethal aid to the Ukraine. This is the highest level it's been since Russia's full-scale invasion. It's up 9% in the last year. So 65% support giving Ukraine long-range missiles, 68% back selling US weapons to European allies that could help Ukraine, 69% favor a NATO-style collective defense commitment for Ukraine, as 74% support a demilitarized zone with the US and EU air support. A separate poll, a slim majority, 51% of Americans think that any peace deal forcing Ukraine to give up territory or restrict its military is unacceptable. 74% of US respondents said that it matters that Ukraine defend its sovereignty against Russian aggression. So what does this say to you about how Americans want Trump to approach this situation?
Well, it says to me that Americans are fundamentally more decent people than their government. And I think this has always been the case. Like, Americans are generally good people. And I've always felt that when I've encountered Americans, both out here, both in America and in my professional capacity. And it's incredibly frustrating that the government, which is, they always try and do the popular thing on this issue, they're not doing the one thing that Americans overwhelmingly want the government to do, which is to support Ukraine. Funny enough, I actually had that polling data in front of me, and one of the other interesting things is that if you look at the number of Americans that view Russia as an enemy, 79% of Americans view Russia as an enemy, 75% view Ukraine as an ally. So yeah, this is not really a controversial subject in America. Americans are overwhelmingly pro-Ukraine. They overwhelmingly don't like Russia. They don't want to have an alliance with Russia. If you poll them on whether they want to be, allied with Europe, so UK, Germany, France, or Russia, I mean, it's a tiny, tiny fringe that would ever choose Russia over America's traditional allies, especially countries like the UK, which, the special relationship, obviously, we kind of mock that from time to time, but it does exist. And the idea, I think, for Americans that you'd want to swap the UK, work, the allies that had been with America through thick and thin for over a century now, for Russia, which has been historically, obviously, they were allied in World War II, but allies of convenience, absolutely. The idea that you'd want to swap Russia for the UK, or it's bizarre to most Americans. Like, they just can't understand it. So, yeah, Americans are far better than their government. Or I would say probably always have been, and the government should listen to the American people because the American people are smarter than the administration on this.
You and I could spend, hours and hours trying to analyze Donald Trump's brain, his every move, which will be difficult. But I want to kind of pick your brain about something. We know that Trump wants to have his name on a peace deal if it's brokered between Russia and Ukraine. He wants to broker another peace deal with another war. He wants to potentially win a Nobel Peace Prize. The reasons behind Trump's desires, I guess, don't really matter, because who really cares if he wins a peace prize? What does it matter if this is what he wants? But what does matter if he sells out Ukraine and doesn't treat Russia as the aggressor in order to get that? So what I wonder, Jimmy, is why does the US president not realize that he will be celebrated on such a large spectrum if he ends this war while propping up Ukraine?
Yeah, it's very strange. And I do wonder about some of the people that he has around him, that seem to be more motivated by personal self-interest, particularly in the case of Witkoff and Kushner, rather than the interests of America and, the West in general. Yeah, and it's also strange. I think Trump is increasingly living in a kind of a bubble where he only hears, good news, kind of similar to Putin in a way. The advisors don't want to bring in bad news because they'll get shouted at. Um, so yeah, it is very strange because Trump literally, if Trump secured some form of deal which was in Ukraine's interests, he could come to Kyiv, he could walk down Krashatek, which is the main, it's like Ukraine's version of Oxford Street, and he could walk into Maidan, which is like their version of Trafalgar Square, and they would cheer him. He'd finally be adored. He'd finally be adored in the way that he's always wanted, but's never managed to achieve. He'd have his big parade. He could, ride on a tank. He could do all the things he wants to do, but and really all he needs to do is to follow a typical, traditional Republican American line on this. This is it's he likes to talk about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would be able to see exactly what's happening here. He would be 100% supportive of Ukraine, and he would he would be supporting them with everything they need, and he would be making, his typical speeches about evil empires and democracy and what have you. But yeah, it's very strange that Trump can't see this because he's never going to win a Nobel Peace Prize by selling out Ukraine. And not to mention a bunch of his other wars that he thought that he solved are now unraveling, and Cambodia and Thailand are going airstriking each other and using artillery on each other again. So yeah, I mean, I think we have to dial back the number of wars that he thinks he's ended at this point.
Zelensky met with EU leaders from the UK, France, and Germany in London, which he hailed as good and productive. He will now take this revised peace plan to the Trump administration today after pushing back against these previous land concession demands made by the United States. So, how optimistic are you, Jimmy, that the US will look at this revised deal with open eyes, open ears, and that potentially take it to Putin?
I'm not massively optimistic, to be honest. I think part of this whole process is it's like kabuki theater, it's kind of it's nobody actually believes that Russia would accept any of these proposals. I don't even think anyone really believes that they would have accepted the original 28-point peace plan, which was Kirill Dmitriev freelancing to a large degree. Knowing the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov had no input into that. So I think it's a case of, Russia is stalling for time. They're trying to make the Americans believe that they're serious about peace, and unfortunately the stupider members of the administration are buying it. I'm not optimistic about any of these proposals. I think Ukrainians are doing what they need to do, which is to try and be as productive as possible while sticking to the red lines, right? The red lines which they have, which is, they're not going to give up territory. They're not going to agree to some form of security guarantee without knowing what it is, because, again, it's ridiculous. You can't agree to a security guarantee without knowing what it constitutes and what the arrangements would be. So yeah, I'm not optimistic, unfortunately. I wish I was.
Just finally, Jimmy, Russia's Prosecutor General Office has approved an indictment accusing 41 current and former Ukrainian officials of genocide against ethnic Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk. So Moscow claims that these officials deliberately targeted Russian civilians in Donbas with the intent of committing genocide dating back to 2014. So this indictment asserts that nearly 5,000 civilians were killed, around 13,000 injured in this alleged campaign. I mean, how ironic and desperate is this from Russia to flip the narrative and say that Ukraine is committing a genocide inside of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, even Yevgeny Prigozhin said that this was complete nonsense in his famous video that was recorded just before he marched on Moscow. He said that all of the claims that Ukraine was conducting genocide against, well, Ukrainians in the occupied territories, because there are still no Russians there apart from Russians that have moved to these territories, but the claim that Ukraine was conducting a genocide, he said, was completely false. He said it was invented by the Russian Defense Ministry. And this is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He was the head of Wagner. He said it was just complete nonsense. And it's complete and utter nonsense. You can look at the monitoring, the UN monitoring missions in Ukraine, and they had access to both sides, and they would say it's complete nonsense. And to be honest, I don't think even the Russians believe this. It's just complete nonsense.
Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you for having me.